Very happy to have you here. We hope you had a great morning, and we'll continue to enjoy the panels that SISAAS has put together for us today. My name is Jeannie Maddox Tungara, Associate Professor of History here at Howard University, and I'm subbing for my colleague, Dr. Kito Swan. I'm a professor of African history and African diaspora history. So this has a special meaning for me. We cover a small portion of India as we do our intro classes and swing through the 5 continents where Africans and people of African descent reside. So I have a special interest in the programs that are coming today. It is exciting for me, and I hope it's just as exciting for you. So the panelists are sitting in order of presentation in the program. I will just introduce them very briefly. They will add on as it's their turn to speak. Anything else that they feel that they want you to know specifically, but their bios are in your program, very brief bios, and I'm sure there are some additional things that they might want to mention in the process of presenting their material. So we have Dr. Elaine Hudson, who is a full professor teaching at the Tillotson University in Austin, Texas. Welcome. And she's a historian. Most of them are historians, in fact. We have next to her, in order of presentation, Dr. Omar Ali, who is professor of comparative African diaspora history and dean of the Lloyd International Honors College at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. Next to him, we have John McLeod. Professor McLeod got his PhD in Indian history at the University of Toronto, and he is now a full professor of history at the University of Louisville. Next to him, we have Dr. Benito Ferrao. Dr. Benito Ferrao is a visiting assistant professor of English and Asian and Pacific Islander American Studies at the College of William and Mary here in Virginia. And our final speaker will be Chris Manjapra, who is currently writing a book on the global history of plantations and the transcontinental and inter-imperial entanglements that made agriculture possible. He was a fellow at the Radcliffe Institute at Harvard University and the Wissenschaftskolleg. Okay, excuse me, Dr. Macklin, I am not fluent in German. Okay, in Berlin. So let's have a round of applause for these volunteers. We look forward to hearing what they have to say, and without further ado, I'll pass the microphone to Dr. Hudson.
Good afternoon. So today I just want to talk a little about the history of Africans and BlueJeans enslaved in Arabia. And I called my paper, By Appearance, She is an African. This presentation is from a chapter that in progress for a larger manuscript that I'm calling I Now Pray for My Freedom, which is on the lives of African and Baluch slaves, mostly African and Baluch slaves, and the information is gleaned from British archival records that have been used by several scholars, that some that reside in the India Office records and the British Library, and then others from the Foreign Office and the National Archives in Britain. So this chapter is a chapter that I'm attempting, one of the introductory chapters, in order to situate these enslaved people in the history of slavery in the region, and then also trying to get an idea of the social and cultural world that they lived in. And so I'm attempting to talk a little bit about that through literature in this chapter, and also to discuss the notions of ethnicity that were at play in the region and give some history to those notions of ethnicity as well. So currently I've been a little bit more successful at unearthing information about Blackness and about Africanness more than about BlueJeans on the Arabian Peninsula, but I'm hoping to get at that later. And as some Baluchi slaves were of African descent, they are in some ways covered in the information I want to talk about today. So the slaves I study are, on the whole, not the ones that go on to rule areas or wield any substantial power. And instead, they are the bulk of slaves in the 20th century on the Arabian Peninsula who performed very mundane commercial, domestic, and agricultural work. They're the water carriers and the stone cutters and the shop assistants and the camel herders and shepherds, and then also date palm gardeners, pearl divers, and sailors. And so in this way, I'm differing from a number of my co-presenters today who focus on more elite slaves. As I said, many of the slaves in my study are African or of African descent, including some of those captured from Baluchistan, who were descendants of Africans enslaved in Baluchistan for generations before. But there are also some Arabs from Iraq and Yemen in the data, but they're a very small minority. So I wasn't quite sure how grounded in the geography people would be, so I just have some very, very simple slides here. So I'm showing here just the Arabian Peninsula, and my work is attempting to try and say something and set up some parameters on slavery on the entire peninsula. So both the Red Sea side, which is mostly going to be Saudi Arabia, I just said the entire peninsula, but it's going to be a little bit less about Yemen because I've had a very hard time kind of getting a handle on what's happening in Yemen at any time because of some of their kind of political weaknesses down there in the century. And then also around the other side to the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea. So one place that I think people often aren't all right, so when we're talking about enslavement, all right, now I know what's going on. Sorry. So when we talk about there we go. So when we talk about slave Africans coming to Arabia, and you want to know about slave routes and slave sources, in many ways it's going to depend on what side of the peninsula you're talking about. And so this is just a map that I gleaned from someone else that doesn't completely capture what's going on, but so for the Saudi Arabian side on the Red Sea, the majority of slaves in Saudi Arabia are going to be coming from the Sudan and coming across the Red Sea. And then with a good deal of them also coming from Ethiopia and up through the Red Sea and then into Saudi Arabia. But then also what's not captured here is you get a decent number of people from Nigeria, what is now Nigeria, and people who are going to be called Takrunis, coming from right around here, around the Lake Chad area, from Nigeria, from Niger, and from Chad. When you're talking about the Persian Gulf side, again, Ethiopians are going to they're so lucky they're going to get tapped on both sides of the of the Arabian Peninsula. So they're also coming off into Oman and around into the Persian Gulf and into the Arabian Sea. But then a good deal of Africans are going to be coming from the Swahili coast, from this East African coast, out of Zanzibar, and then also on the other side of the shore, and then coming up around Oman, because they have to come around Oman and for other reasons. Oman is going to be very instrumental in the slave trade of getting East Africans onto the Persian Gulf side and the Arabian Sea side of the peninsula. For those of you who aren't, and this is not helping much, who, what happens if I do this? Nothing. All right, so for people who aren't cognizant of, there we go, of Baluchistan. So Baluchistan today is part of eastern Iran and western Pakistan. It takes up quite a good piece of Pakistan, actually. Here, its largest city is going to be, I don't know how to pronounce these things, Quetta, up here. And so Baluchistan is, as I said, in eastern Iran and western Pakistan. It's bounded by the Gulf of Oman to the south, Afghanistan to the north, and historically it's been described as ranging as far west as, and I can't see that, the city of Kerman, I think it's here, in the Iranian city of Kerman and its province of Luristan, and then to the west to the Pakistani province of Sindh and the city of Shikarpur in the east. And then currently the Iranian province of Sistan and Baluchistan is bounded by, there's a small little village here, Gachi, and then in Pakistan it's going to, Karachi is going to be over here on its eastern side. So when we talk about Baluchi people coming into Arabia, it's going to be, again, through Oman is going to be very important in this process. And it's going to go in several ways. So Omanis are taking East African people onto the coast there in the Persian Gulf. But then in the early 19th century, you get the Sultan Busaid, who's also taking Baluchi soldiers to extend his reach into East Africa. And we don't know how many of those soldiers were pressed into action, were slaves, or were volunteers in that trade. And then just because to be a little trendy, I've got a word cloud here. Within Baluchistan, one of the things that I'm trying to do in my work is trying to find all of the names and all of the ways in which people of African descent, who are Afro-Baluchi, the ways in which they are described, so that even if they're not described as looking like by appearance being African, that I'll be able to tag them in my research so that I can see if there are any differences between Afro-Baluchis and Baluchis, between Baluchis and Africans enslaved in Arabia, in terms of the way in which they live and the way in which they work. I forgot when I started. Oh, geez, Louise. All right, so one of the things that, so in this first chapter, one of the things that I've been trying to do is bring this context of Blackness and Africanness and see the ways in which Arab and Persian poetry and prose have referred to that blackness and to that Africanness. And I start in the pre-Islamic period with the pre-Islamic Arabian poets, and then go forward into the 20th century. And some of these writers in the Arabian tradition are of African descent themselves. So I've been taking a look at some of the writings of a group of men who are described as the Aghrabat al-Arab, the crows of the Arabs. And looking, and so far I've found a couple of themes that have emerged from their work. Blackness as a religious curse, otherwise known as the Hamitic, the Hamitic theory. African phenotype is ugly. Blackness as a reason just in and of itself for slavery. Blackness as a barrier to marriage. Blackness as a barrier to full inclusion in kinship relationships. Blackness as a reason for alienation of black men from Arab and Persian women. And then, of course, on the other side of it, whiteness as its better binary. And I have a couple of quotes here, but I've taken up too much time talking about other things, but let me see if I can just kind of get through one or two. It's in terms of blackness as being ugly, in Iranian literature, they go a little bit even further, and they often describe Africans as monsters and devils and enemies of mankind. So in one Iranian myth, I guess, they talk about the Zanjis, which is a word that they use for Africans. A Zanji as big as a mountain, darker than black ink, with the face of a human, but teeth like a boar's tusks and the tail of donkey. There's a poet called Al-Mutanabi, who's a 9th century poet, and when he joined the court of an African slave leader in Egypt, at first he courted him, but he even uses the Hamitic theory to court him. So in it, he talks about, had Shem seen you, Kafur, he would have told his progeny, may all my progeny, my soul and wealth, be the ransom of your brother's son. So in other words, may the Arabs, who were seen as the sons of Shem, pledge allegiance to Kafur, this man who is a son of Ham. All right, and then for whiteness as the opposite of it, there's an Afro-Arab pre-Islamic poet Antara, who's kind of a warrior and hero figure, and he writes, "Enemies revile me for the blackness of my skin, but the whiteness of my character effaces the blackness." So these are the kind of ideas that I'm looking at in order to try and situate the kind of stereotypes that Africans would have been stepping into, as well as stepping into slavery in this area.
Well, I'm going to try to tell you a little story about somebody who I've been studying for some time, Malik Ambar, and I'm going to go very quickly over just some of the context before we sort of delve into his story. So basically, this world of which he's part of is the Indian Ocean world, the African diaspora, which is something that we talk about today. People who lived at that time didn't think of themselves necessarily as part of a diaspora, right? Is mostly in the western part. It's an area that had a lot of trade going on before the rise of Islam, and as Islam spread in there, new forms of trade emerge or become sort of consolidated. One of the things that you start to see is sort of the rise of military slavery, and both people from these areas of the Indian Ocean world, and also Europeans would actually draw upon Africans as soldiers over time. We've seen actually this map in some of the prior presentations of the flows of humanity out of Africa going into South Asia, into the Middle East. A simple point, not all enslaved people in the Indian Ocean were African, and not all Africans were enslaved in this world. Many Africans were sailors, merchants, and soldiers who traveled across the Indian Ocean on their own accord. So, of course, to kind of go back to what Sheila offered us this morning about sort of looking at the comparison of the Indian Ocean world versus the Atlantic, it just looks different. And so this is what I think is part of the elucidation, to use your word, I think is very interesting, because when you teach a history of the Atlantic and you talk about race, it just looks very different, and again, depending on the time, than it does in the Indian Ocean world. So Islam is an important part of the African diaspora in the Indian Ocean world. Bilal ibn Rabah is the person who kicks off the tradition of the call to prayer. He is part of the early Muslim community. It is a multiracial community at the beginning, and continues to be diverse as Islam spreads. And so this is an image of one of the slave markets. Forgive me for speaking so quickly. I just want to get through as much as possible. And you have, again, some of the flows of humanity coming out of the Horn of Africa into the Middle East, so-called, of course, mostly trading by sea. So African labor in the Indian Ocean world looked very different, depending on who you were, man, woman, soldiers, sailors, but there were also concubines, which was alluded to, administrators, musicians, wet nurses, nannies, all kinds of people, pearl divers, I think Elaine mentioned, construction workers, salt mining. So there are many different kinds of ways in which black people or people of African descent labored for people. And a very famous image of one of the ships of a Nakhoda, of an Indian crew there. African sailors appear in multiple ways throughout there. Ibn Battuta talks about African Abyssinian soldiers and them guarding the sort of the merchant ships of the Western Indian Ocean world. Even if there were pirates, the pirates would be scared if it was known that Abyssinian soldiers were on those ships. And it mentioned also the Zanj. So you have this military guardian, protecting force of African peoples across this world, going back at least as early as the 9th century. I mean, what led ultimately to the big Zanj rebellion of 869, 883 was actually preceded by a number of outbreaks of rebellions there, and they were multiracial rebellions. Different names are used. There's people here who are linguists who have been looking at this, but of course we have at least 3 different names, Kafir, Sidi, Habshi, to designate people of African descent. So once you're introduced to this world, all of a sudden you have to learn multiple terms in order to be able to understand or identify people of African descent. A number of years ago, actually now it's in 2011, one of our dear colleagues, Sylviane Diouf of the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, part of the New York Public Library, and I co-curated an exhibit which was placed online called The African Diaspora in the Indian Ocean World, which is still up there and has some wonderful maps and things like that, some primary sources, some photographs. I urge you to use this as a teaching tool in your classes. If you just put in the African diaspora in the Indian Ocean world, it's one of the first things that pops up. And subsequent to that, with Ken and others, well, Ken specifically, curating physical exhibits that are literally traveling all over the world right now in India, and UNESCO's picked it up. So this African diaspora in the Indian Ocean world has been talked about for some time now. And Joseph Harris talked about this back in like the late 1960s, and others have been looking at aspects of it. But I think we're coming to a point in higher education where now when you talk about black studies, it's included in a way that I feel optimistic about. So not everything is so Atlantic-centered. Not to say the Atlantic is bad. I'm in the Atlantic world. I like the Atlantic world, but there's other parts of the world too. So here we go. So Malik Ambar. So if I may, I want to read from a document in 1627, a year after Malik Ambar's death. The Mughal court chronicler Muhammad Khan wrote, in warfare, in command, in sound judgment, and in administration, he had no rival or equal. So, of course, this is a very, praising sort of characterization of who he is. So even some of Malik Ambar's greatest opponents would have to acknowledge his multiple talents and accomplishments. And I'll talk through where he came from, which is basically Ethiopia, moves into the Arabian Peninsula, and then ends up in the western part of the Deccan, and over the course of about 25 years, rises to become a de facto ruler of the Western Sultanate of Ahmednagar. But writing soon after the death of the Mughal Emperor Jahangir, Ambar's bitterest of enemies, the royal chronicler Khan seemed compelled to include the homage to the Deccani leader in the emperor's memoirs, as if to set the historical record straight. Both Jahangir and before him his father, the Emperor Akbar, who referred to Ambar as, quote, arrogant and evil disposed, and I'm thinking about your language, the ways in which people are talked about of African descent, found it difficult to admit what was apparently well known: Ambar's exceptional military skills, governance, and administration. The fact remained that despite their vast resources and powerful armies, neither emperor was able to conquer the Deccan because of Ambar's relentless defense. So the Mughal empire is above in the northern part of India, northern part, and they're trying to take control of the Deccan, which is the central part. Forever frustrated, Jahangir described Ambar as, quote, dark fate and ill-starred, statements that seem to have been born for him, the emperor. So obsessed did Jahangir become with defeating Ambar that he even commissioned a fantasy painting depicting him shooting arrows through his severed head impaled on a spike. However, other contemporaries, Deccanis, Europeans, and Mughals alike, had other words to describe Ambar. The Persian historian Farishta wrote of his, quote, enterprising character and popularity. The Dutch trader Peter van den Broeke observed how Malik keeps good order and laws in his country. The distinguished Mughal emissary Asad Beg described Ambar as, quote, a brave and discreet man. And the Italian nobleman and traveler Pietro del Valle concluded, this Malik is a man of great parts. In whichever light Ambar is portrayed, the historical record makes clear that he was an extraordinary figure. Ambar's career, his rise from slavery in East Africa to ruler in South Asia, sheds light on the diverse mix of people, products, and practices that shaped the Indian Ocean world during the early modern period, basically the 15th through the 18th centuries there. Originally from Ethiopia, historically called Abyssinia, Ambar is best known for having defended the Deccan from being occupied by the Mughals during the first quarter of the 17th century. His ingenuity as a military leader, his diplomatic skills, and his land reform policies contributed much to the success in keeping the Deccan free of Mughal imperial rule during his lifetime. Like the great Deccani political leader Chand Bibi, he engendered admiration, respect, and jealousy. And like her, his example inspired his generation and generations thereafter to fight for their independence. Born in approximately 1548 in Hararge, in eastern part of Ethiopia, where the highlands meet the lowlands, Ambar was ethnically Oromo, a pastoral and semi-agricultural people whose religious and spiritual practices included ancestral veneration and whose social and political organization was based on the age-grade Gada system. Ambar was captured as a young person and sold into slavery and taken to southern Arabia in approximately 1560. From there, he was traded and taken up to Baghdad. He converted to Islam and was subsequently educated while in the service of Mir Qasim, a Baghdadi merchant who took him to India. Around 1571, Ambar was sold in Western India to the Abyssinian statesman Mirak Dabir, more widely known as Genghis Khan. Khan, who had once been a slave himself, was now the prime minister, the Peshwa, of the Nizam Shah, the Sultan of Ahmednagar in the northwestern part of the Deccan. Khan spent several years mentoring Ambar in the ways of the court and the military, but was murdered in 1574. Leaving Ahmednagar, after being freed by Khan's widow, which is interesting that in some ways there was a self-conscious effort to actually manumit him. It was unusual. Ambar led a small cavalry force serving as a mercenary in neighboring Bijapur as part of the thousands of African slave soldiers and mercenaries who were in demand among Indian monarchs at the time. In 1595, Ambar returned to Ahmednagar Sultanate to help protect its capital and main fort against Mughal attack before dispersing into the countryside and continuing to build his own following. At the turn of the 17th century, Ambar, now with a sizable army under his command, made himself regent on behalf of a young royal member of the family he installed as Nizam Shah. Ambar later placed another young heir onto the Nizam Shahi throne, continuing to serve as de facto ruler until his death in 1626 at the age of approximately 80. So every few years when the figurehead was a little bit older, that figurehead would die somehow, and then a new one would be installed. That happened 3 times, actually. Not only was Ambar a skilled diplomat, administrator, and military strategist whose name was known to emperors, princes, and peasants alike, but he also developed a highly effective form of guerrilla warfare, Bargi Giri, which employed quick-striking Maratha light cavalry. Ambar strengthened Ahmednagar's existing fortifications, created an innovative land revenue system that increased agricultural productivity, designed and built a model capital, Kirki, with palaces, mosques, and an extensive water supply system, maximized the flow of trade in his realm, and patronized Muslim and Hindu artisans, adding to the unique artistry of the region. Most famously, however, and for over a quarter century, Ambar defended the Deccan against Mughal incursions, at times conceding territory to the northern imperialists, but then turning around and pushing them out. Allow me to read just the full quote from Mutad Khan in 1627. 2 minutes, got it. In warfare, in command, in sound judgment, and in administration, he had no rival or equal, something I read at the beginning. He continues, he kept down the turbulent spirits, maintained his exalted position to the end of his life, and closed his career in honor. History records no other instance of an Abyssinian slave arriving at such eminence. That was written in 1627. So this is the story of Malik Ambar, who's one of perhaps the best known of the African elites. He was part of thousands of people that were taken from basically this area, the Horn of Africa, to India. In his journey, it was through the Middle East. And if you're interested sometime at looking at some of the primary sources, I'm more than happy to send you this. But basically what I try to do is draw upon a combination of merchant documents, Dutch merchant documents. He even had correspondence. There's correspondence from King Philip referring to Ambar, and then the different Mughal and Bijapuri and other court chroniclers. So that's what's documented in the book. So with that, I will get off this platform and go to the next person. And I just want to show a couple of images while I have 30 seconds left. Shukriya to all of you. Those are the 2 books that I just referred to. And thank you very much.
Okay, well, hello everybody. My name is John McLeod, and before I get going, I would really like to thank Jasmine for the phenomenal job that she's done here. It's the amount of work that would have gone into this is just, for those who have not organized conferences, it's breathtaking. A couple of people have mentioned the conference. Sheila mentioned the conference in Goa in 2006, and I think this is a worthy successor to that. Amy, Sheila, Pash, I haven't seen any of you since Goa, and it's great seeing you again. Great also meeting a whole bunch of new friends, so thanks very much. Omar's paper brought to life for us Malik Ambar. And as I think he mentioned, Malik Ambar was the best known of India's African strongmen, but over the centuries there were many more. And in fact, Janjira and Sachin, the last 2 African-ruled kingdoms in India, disappeared less than 70 years ago. And today I'd just like to say a few words about these kingdoms, maybe to introduce them to you. And first of all, Janjira. Here we've got a map of the west coast of India. Probably a little hard to discern anything on it, so you'll just have to take my word for it. The name Janjira comes from Jazira, the Arabic word for island, and it originally referred to a fortified island by that name on the west coast of India. This is about 40 miles south of Mumbai. And in the late 15th century, the island of Janjira became part of the Sultanate of Ahmednagar. And as we just heard, about 100 years later, Malik Ambar became the master of Ahmednagar. And Ambar consistently appointed fellow Africans as commandants of the island. That may have been because of its strategic importance. He felt the only people that he could trust were people who were Africans like him. And in the 1620s, as Mughal pressure mounted on Ahmednagar, the incumbent commandant became effectively independent. And he's therefore considered to have been the first Nawab, or monarch, of the state of Janjira. Ambar's commandants and the early Nawabs were joined in Janjira by their families, soldiers, and subordinates, many of whom would also have been Africans. All were Muslims, either by birth or by conversion. And they and their descendants were called the Sidi Sardars. Sidi is a common word for African Indians. Sardar means chief. And the Sidi Sardars were the African Indian aristocracy of Janjira. The early Nawabs of Janjira were elected by the Sidi Sardars from among themselves. But from the beginning of the 19th century, the position was hereditary in one family, which still holds the nominal position of head of the Janjira family. The scholar Gwyn Campbell has claimed that elite African Indians, quote, without exception, expressed a local rather than African identity. But the Sidis of Janjira were always aware of their African ancestry. For example, Janjira state was often called Habsan, which comes from the Arabic word for Abyssinia. A coin issued by Janjira was called the Habshi Nishani Rupiah, the rupee marked by the Abyssinian. And the coat of arms of Janjira, which is here, depicts a sort of stylized representation of the island, that little tower in the center, flanked by two African warriors. And for over 100 years, the Sidis of Janjira were constantly threatened by the Marathas. The Marathas were a militarized Hindu community in that area. And to sort of deal with that threat, the Sidis of Janjira fortified their island. They placed a total of 572 cannon on its walls. Most of them are still there. This is my favorite, with a head around the mouth. Inside, on the island itself, there were two lakes that supplied fresh water, and that allowed the inhabitants to withstand blockades. And the island of Janjira was covered with buildings. These are some of them. All of these, unfortunately, have fallen into ruin since the Indian government took control of Janjira from the Sidis in 1948. And it is sort of sad because there are people today who remember when all of these were sort of vibrant, thriving buildings in good shape, but over the last 70 years, they've just sort of fallen to pieces. But while they were on the island, thanks to their firm defenses, the Sidis resisted no fewer than 7 sieges by their enemies, the Marathas. And this is a depiction of one of these sieges. It's an 18th century sort of combination map picture. In the center you see the island of Janjira, and it's surrounded by the ships of the Marathas, who are unsuccessfully trying to capture it. But the Sidis are able to outlast the Marathas. In 1818, the Marathas were conquered by the British, who of course at that time were in the process of establishing themselves as the masters of India. And 16 years after that, in 1834, the British declared Janjira to be subject to their rule. But the Nawab kept his small kingdom, and for over a century his family continued to rule Janjira and the neighboring parts of the mainland under British overlordship. And their little kingdom, it really was a little kingdom, had an area of 326 square miles, population in the 1940s of just over 100,000 people. And it had a lot of very interesting rulers. Probably the greatest of all the rulers of Janjira was this man, Sidi Ahmed, who ruled from 1879 to 1922. And he has got all the sort of standard things that would be seen as kind of, if you like, would at that time have been seen as bringing his state into the 20th century. He built a high school, he built a modern waterworks, instituted local self-government. He was also interested in sort of architectural things, if you like. Among other things, he had a Turkish architect design a magnificent new palace for him on the mainland above the cliffs overlooking the island of Janjira. This is the palace of Ahmedganj, and some pictures of it here. It is an impressive place, sort of cross of European and Turkish architecture. And there you can see down the cliffs over towards Janjira in the distance. And of course a stuffed tiger, which all Indian palaces have to have. On his death in 1922, Sidi Ahmed was succeeded by his son, Sidi Muhammad III, who was a boy at the time. And so his mother ran the government on his behalf. And this is Sidi Muhammad and his mother. Sort of nice portrait, I think. And he finally reached adulthood, took power himself. This is a picture, I think, that belongs to Ken, so I will give Ken credit for that. But in 1947, India became independent of British rule. A few months later, the new government of India decided to end the existence of all of India's myriad princely states. And in March of 1948, Janjira was merged into what is now the state of Maharashtra. And saddened by the loss of his kingdom, Sidi Muhammad III moved away, and he died in 1972. But a few years ago, his son, Sidi Shah Mahmud, returned to Janjira, still lives there, and he began the long process of restoring the Ahmedganj Palace, which his grandfather built. He has had some trouble in recent years from sort of hotel entrepreneurs who have tried to seize the palace. They realized it would make a nice, fancy hotel, but so far he's hanging tight. So that's Janjira. Now the other modern-day African kingdom in India is Sachin, and its history is interlinked with that of Janjira. In 1784, the then Nawab of Janjira died, a man called Abdul Rahim. As was the custom, the Sidi Sardars chose one of their numbers to be the new Nawab. But Abdul Rahim's son, Balu Mian, claimed that by virtue of his parentage, he was the rightful sovereign, and he sought help from the Peshwa, the ruler of the Marathas. And the two men entered into an agreement with British mediation. This is a modern painting showing this agreement, by which the Peshwa recognized Balu Mian as the lawful ruler of Janjira, while Balu Mian immediately then ceded all of his rights to Janjira to the Peshwa. And in return, the Peshwa promised to compensate Balu Mian with land elsewhere. And the idea was that this would give the Peshwa legal title to the island of Janjira, and he could then conquer it. Now, in the event Balu Mian got the better of the deal, the Peshwa was unable to conquer Janjira, but he did give Balu Mian the land that became the state of Sachin. And this was located in Gujarat, had a total area of just 49 square miles, so pretty small, population in 1941 of just over 26,000 people. But like their kinsmen in Janjira, the Nawabs of Sachin identified as Africans. For example, in the year 2000, Balu Mian's 5 great-grandson, the late Nawab Sidi Nasrullah Khan, took part in the first international conference on African Indians. I was not there, but Amy was present, I think. And a few years after that, he very kindly wrote the foreword to the book African Elites, which I and Ken Robbins edited. And this is the palace of Sachin. And here are some of the other rulers of that kingdom. Sidi Ibrahim II, Sidi Ibrahim III, who fought with distinguished gallantry in World War I, and Hyder Khan, who became Nawab in 1930. He's seated there in the middle. Like Sidi Muhammad III of Janjira, though, Sidi Hyder of Sachin was displaced from the throne after India became independent, and in June of 1948, Sachin was absorbed into what's now Gujarat state. And that kind of completes the history of the last African kings in India. Both of these two royal families ruled right down until 1948. But although they are no longer in power, the royal families of Janjira and Sachin still exist. Here's the Sachin family in the 1980s. In the center is the last ruling Nawab, Sidi Hyder Khan's brother, Surur Khan. At the left is his son, Dr. Nasrullah Khan. And at the right is the current head of the family, Nasrullah's son, Reza Khan. And in the year 2004, I had the great pleasure of being given a personal tour of Janjira by my friend, Princess Faiza Jastanwala Williams. She's the granddaughter of the last Nawab of Janjira. She has a PhD in history and teaches at the University of Aberystwyth in Wales. And here are Faiza and a somewhat younger version of me standing on the walls of the fort of Janjira. And it was really a great pleasure and a privilege to visit the most famous African-built fortress in India in the company of a woman who comes from the family that both built this fortress and also represents the most durable dynasty of Africans in India. I think I will wrap up there so that we can keep on to our schedule, but thank you very much, and thanks.
I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous owners of the land upon which we've gathered, the Piscataway, and the enslaved whose lives inform the history of this country. My thanks to the organisers of this symposium, which would not have been possible without your hard work. The tall one bathes from basin chanting, "I cleanse myself of the mortal world." On the floor, she draws a circle chanting, "I consecrate this place." Naked, save for the sacred stone around her neck, she stands in the middle of the circle chanting, "I stand at the portal of the spirit world." With her arms raised, she begins to dance, chanting, "I call upon Fumu Kutu, the migrating soul." She spins faster and faster, chanting, "I am Zamba Undoki, who takes the form of her choosing." The passage I've just read you is from the 2001 novel Skin by Margaret Mascarenhas. This is the moment at which Consolação reinvokes a dormant tradition passed down to her matrilineally by an enslaved ancestor who had been wrenched from the region we now know as Angola. Through the incantation she utters, she transforms into a panther to find her twins who've been kidnapped by her abusive husband. But the setting of this moment of a remembering of Africa by the descendants of slaves is not the Americas, but Goa of the early 19th century, which was part of the Indian Ocean slave trade in contrast to the Atlantic trade, but also connected to it. In Skin, Mascarenhas employs the historical legend of Kimba Vita, or Dona Beatriz, a 17th century Angolan Congolese prophetess, to tell a story that bridges the Portuguese colonies of Angola in Africa and Goa in Asia. Kimba Vita, or Dona Beatriz, will be familiar to many as a revolutionary who preached that Christ was a black man, whose disciples were 6 men and 6 women of African origin. Kimba Vita used the very Catholicism the Portuguese had brought to Africa against them, and for this she was burnt at the stake for heresy. But it was also because she sought the unity of her native Angola, which was divided by the Portuguese. Fictionalizing history in Skin, a lone surviving child of Kimba Vita's is enslaved and brought to Goa. This child is named Zinga Ngunga, in honor of Queen Anne Zinga, a 17th century Angolan leader who resisted the Portuguese. It is then Zinga Ngunga's descendants who continue the traditions of the African homeland in the Luso-Asian colony of Goa. Mascarenhas' treatment of African Goan identity allows for a transcartographic and transhistorical perspective on race, as I will seek to demonstrate, while also exposing its fissures. Further, the Luso-Afro-Asiatic connection Skin draws through Kimba Vita's descendants links the Indian and Atlantic Ocean trades in black enslavement, for it was the Portuguese who transported the Angolan enslaved to the New World in the Atlantic. By invoking multiple cultural traditions and racial identities that converge in, but do not settle on the idea of the Goan, Skin amply demonstrates how such subjectivity disturbs hermetic constructions of nationalistic identity, because Goan history exists within and outside that of the Indian nation state. As Mascarenhas' novel chronicles, Goa's history connects it to the worlds of the Indian Ocean, the Portuguese Empire in Africa, as also to African slavery and the Black Atlantic. My thoughts here follow recent trends in Indian Ocean scholarship that aim to identify networks that predate and extend beyond the contemporary notion of the nation-state, while at the same time examining the complexities of identity formations born of such histories. Even as Africa, site of their origin, recedes into the background of the slave-descended family's history in the novel, African legacies continue to manifest and transform culturally in the new locations in which the enslaved women and their descendants find themselves. In happening outside of the slavery-based Anglo-American circuit that Paul Gilroy focuses on in the Black Atlantic, Africanist in Skin parallels and intersects with Atlantic slavery. Yet as part of the same historical moment as that of Atlantic slavery, the novel also broadens the diasporic remit of black identities outside Africa. Though removed from their African homeland, Kimba Vita's descendants retain and develop Angolan culture in contexts that are alien to them. Simultaneously, with each subsequent generation, this Africanness also becomes Goan, a hybridity that metaphorically represents a colonial culture that develops over time. Even as multiple traditions intertwine, the fact of blackness is neither erased culturally nor physically. If for Gilroy, blackness is Anglo-Americanness and happens to the exclusion of Africa, then Skin recalls not just a far more convoluted and interlinked terrain of Africanness, but also Africa's belonging in the Indian Ocean world. Critics of Mascarenhas' novel reductively suggest that it is far too sentimental, and especially when it comes to its symbolization of Africa. But I would argue that what these critics fail to grasp is the political possibility that Africa represents in the novel. For example, at the time that India became independent in 1947, Goa was still under the Portuguese, as were nations in Africa, such as Angola and Mozambique. Divesting Goa from Portuguese rule, which would give impetus to the freedom struggles in Portuguese Africa, it was believed, caused African leaders to pressure India. However, in liberating Goa on December 19, 1961, India gave short shrift to the indigenous and diasporic efforts of Goans towards their own political emancipation. That some of these Goan efforts for decolonization took root in Africa itself, where prominent Goans were additionally involved in local independence movements, speaks to Africa's place in the Goan historical imaginary. As Skin captures it, Africa symbolizes a desire for and recall of other political possibilities, curtailed by the region's absorption into the Indian post-colonial state and away from its other networks within the Indian Ocean and the Lusophone sphere. The novel itself has much to say about 1961, when Goa forcibly became part of India. But in the time remaining, I'd like to explore how the book considers white affectivity and its complex tale of two families whose intermeshed lives traverse multiple continents over several centuries. The Miranda flourishes an upper-caste Goan family of Saraswat Brahmin origins, whose wealth grows out of the Portuguese African slave trade, among other enterprises. Their counterparts are the descendants of Kimba Vita, as I've already mentioned. In this, the novel traverses the realities of Indian Ocean slavery, an often forgotten history in the study of black displacement, though descendants of this period continue to live in Goa and Karnataka and are collectively known as Siddhis, as we've heard. Though domination is imminent to the imperial project, the novel exposes the constituting of Portuguese identity as a process of self-invention that was highly dependent on colonial contact. In this, the book emphasizes how imperial identity constructs itself by relying on colonial state formation, where unable to forego its connection to the other, the colonizer must always mask dependence as racial domination. In Black Skin, White Masks, Frantz Fanon intones how the colonial process creates and cements difference to the degree that the colonial, even though he is in the minority, does not feel that this makes him inferior. Fanon's views apply to Skin, which situates the survival of blackness outside Africa, the creation of whiteness outside Europe, and the making of colonial Asianness in the contestatory space of Goa, where none of these racializations are discrete. In the novel, Maria de Miranda, who is married to Bernardo Flores, thus giving rise to the Miranda Flores name, has an affair with the Spanish Jesuit priest Agustin Cabello Martinez. Mascarenhas writes, "The impromptu amalgamation of cells from the Castilian and Saraswat pools was an aesthetic success. Alma was a breathtakingly beautiful child with bewitching emerald eyes. There was something Moorish and wild about her." In Alma, Mascarenhas conjures a miscegenated archive of Moorish, Iberian, Goan history. But rather than thwart racialized difference, the mestizo child evokes the colonial making of new identities and the reworking of old ones. Already having become the recipient of an aristocratic title from his Portuguese godfather, Bernardo de Miranda Flores' fathering of a green-eyed child only goes further into blurring the transference of power between aristocratic blood and the bourgeois body, as Foucault deciphers in the History of Sexuality. To the emphasis on this body, Foucault correlates the process of growth and establishment of bourgeois hegemony because of what the cultivation of its body could represent politically, economically, and historically for the present and the future of bourgeoisie. To this end, Heredity and progeny are a vital component. Nonetheless, even as the Miranda Flores patriarch believes Alma to be his own because it ensures that his family name and legacy will be perpetuated, his blind acceptance of the aristocratic European bodily trait of her green eyes transforms colonial whiteness into bourgeois Goanness. Just as it serves to cultivate a kind of acceptable bourgeois body, it also performs as a cultural conduit between the racialized body of the colonized and colonial whiteness. The irony, of course, is that Alma is not actually the patriarch's biological child, but also that he does in fact have a biological child, one he has sired by raping Zinga Ngunga, the enslaved daughter of Kimba Vita. And Zinga Ngunga successfully keeps the child's true paternity secret, not least because her daughter is dark-skinned. 2 children, Perpetua and Alma, both of mixed-race origins and both female, but only one can be an heir to continue the legacy of the Miranda Flores clan. Here, both children display multiple possibilities of Goan identity. It is ironic that the illegitimate daughter, markedly so because of her Africanness, is actually the product of Don Bernardo's loins, while the other daughter, who's of green-eyed European ancestry, is not. Goan historian Fatima da Silva Gracias notes that after Portuguese navigator Afonso de Albuquerque defeated Alvel Shah, the ruler of Goa, in 1510, among his first acts was the encouragement of mixed marriages via his Política dos Casamentos, or marriage policy. Da Silva Gracias explains the colonial pragmatism of the policy, for its primary motive was to create a white identity in India, which would help to perpetuate the Portuguese rule in Estado de India, a new community that would form the backbone of Portuguese power in Asia. This construction of whiteness, however, could never be the same as European whiteness, for it would be the product of misogyny. At the same time, in that historical moment, it was the instantiation of a new whiteness in the colonial space of Goa. Its purpose, as the Silva Gracias suggests, was to create a source of racialized identity within the colony, but it also provided the possibility of remaking whiteness in the colonial center. Iberia, Spain, and Portugal, itself the former enclave of the Moors, cannot forego a history of being marked, culturally and or racially, even as the conquerors exit. Portugal's colonization of the other can therefore be considered as an attempt to remake its own racial image. Goa provided this opportunity in being ruled by Muslim, who for the Portuguese bore little distinction from being a Moor himself. Even as the newly created group of miscegenated subjects allowed the Portuguese to be more white in comparison, the semi-whiteness also meant something to the Goan bourgeoisie, as Mascarenhas' novel implies. Alma's green eyes signify a colonial history of politicized mestizo culture, which allowed for the remaking of Portuguese identity as a new whiteness, but which also shaped native identity. Even as de Albuquerque sought to create a white race in Goa, it was to be a group differentiated from the colonizers themselves. In skin, the Miranda Flores' green-eyed daughter cathects them to the white colonizer, even as it does not make the family white. This near-whiteness is then augmented against the bodies of black slaves, the ownership of whom creates a secondary level of colonial racialization of class privilege. Just as the Portuguese came into their whiteness through the institution of miscegenation that they initiated, the Miranda Flores acquire their racial and class status through a similarly relational process because of their ownership of African slaves. These intimate relations, which do not preclude acts of violence, are at once desirous and oppositional. In short, they are unstable because of the dangerous possibility of the revelation of this intimacy. In the novel, Pagan, a 20th century descendant of the Miranda Flores, learns of the affair between Maria de Miranda Flores and the Jesuit priest from the family's maid Esperanza. Descended from the Angolan slaves on whose backs the Miranda Flores had built their fortunes, Esperanza came to know of the affair from her great-grandmother Consolação, who was a slave.
So I'd like to also take a moment to thank Jasmine for this wonderful conference. It's very exciting. And I'll say just a word at first of why this is so exciting, especially from my perspective, given the kind of history that I write, and then I'll launch into my example here. And I think that studying the intersections between Africana studies and South Asian studies is not just a complex thought, but it's a complex thought process, by which I mean that it requires, even to ask the questions that are thrown up through the study of these two fields at their intersection, requires that we think about juxtaposition, we think about comparison in a new light, we think about entanglement, we think about queer intimacies, we think about the simultaneities of different kinds of temporality, we think about submarine relations, we think about a form of complexity that goes beyond a dialectic that may comfortably take place in the light of the Enlightenment, but rather we are forced to fathom or become aware of connections between the African and the Indic that, at least metaphorically speaking, happen at night. And so, for those reasons, I find the theme of this conference so exciting, because I think there's a theory of history for me that is possible at this intersection that is really yet to be fully kind of elaborated. And it's exciting that there's a group of scholars who are doing this kind of work. Let me shift gears, because we don't have much time, to a story, and then I'll give just some highlights from the current research that I'm doing. I'm writing a book on the global expansion of agricultural industry and the plantation complex. So my story actually will relate to this idea of relationality. And in some ways, this term Caribbeanity is a stand-in for a way of thinking about relation. Across the British West Indies and the whole British Empire, the slave trade and the institution of slavery was officially abolished in 1834. This is conventionally said to mark the end of bondage, the rise of liberalism, the origin point for an eventual freedom for all. For 4 years following that date, a halfway house institution was erected called apprenticeship. During the apprentice period, enslaved African-descended people from across the British Caribbean were put into a new legal category, the apprentice, in which they were half property and half person. They were made into debt peons, paying off half of the price of their manumission through their work, while the other half would be borne by the British state, which authorized a mind-bogglingly large compensation package for the slave owners of the British Caribbean in 1834. Damned as property and damned as persons, the so-called apprentices were made to compensate their enslavers for the slave owners' losses instead of the other way around. Slave owners, sensing the end of their way of life, what Jean Rhys describes in her beautiful novel as the, quote, death of the plantation gardens, seemed intent to whip, to compel, to coerce the last drops of life and labor out of a decaying system. But they did not confine the whip within the bounds of the Caribbean, and this is where a new kind of comparativity and relation emerges. In fact, they began to whip, compel, and coerce laborers in the workhouses of Ireland, of Scotland, and of southern England. But more importantly, across Asia, especially South Asia and the South China Sea, as a new institution which we know as indenture came to be. So that's just to give a kind of historical context. Now the story. This story comes from the plantation Vredenhoop, or Peace and Hope. Plantations are always named in these grotesquely inverse utopic terms. So from the quote-unquote Peace and Hope plantation of British Guyana, which was owned by someone named John Gladstone, who was at this point soon to become the father of William Gladstone, the Prime Minister of England. But let's not talk about John Gladstone, let's talk about Rose, who we only know by her first name, an African Guyanese woman, a slave on the Vredenhoop plantation. She was deposed by a fact-finding committee about events that had recently transpired there. She testified, quote, I recollect some of the coolies running away and going to Berbice long time ago. It was 2 or 3 months after they came. I heard they went to Berbice. We were free before they went away. Adonis, who was a black slave foreman, and Ram Singh, who was an Indian sardar, or an overseer of the coolies, well, they were sent to fetch them. The coolies returned before Adonis and Ram Singh came back. I saw them when they were brought to the estate, but I did not see who brought them. They were carried to the sick house. Next day, they flogged all of those that ran away. They flogged all from the sick house together and took them to the Negro yard to be flogged. I saw them flogged. Mr. Jacobs was the only white man present. The driver for them flogged them. They were flogged one after the other. They got more than 3 licks, but I cannot say how many, and cannot say that they got 5. Their backs were not cut, but in bumps. They appeared to me as severely punished. This is for me key. They appeared to me to be as severely punished as my mateys were during the apprenticeship when they were flogged. They were flogged with the cat o' nine tails, the same as was formerly in use. Some cried and some did not cry. There was no blood. But when the blacks have been flogged, I have seen blood on their backs, unquote. For me, that's really a remarkable testimony or testament, partly because of the forensic detail of Rose, the kind of the scientific mind that you see at work as she's dissecting a set of experiences and weighing what are the similarities and the differences between what she saw under this indentureship system and what she remembered from apprenticeship and what she remembered from the period before apprenticeship. So the complexity of that imagination fascinates me. But beyond that, there is a kind of relational imaginary that she is articulating, especially when she talks about there being bumps on the backs of the indentured servants, but when the blacks had been flogged, well, there was blood. So that just is, I think, one concrete example of how this kind of relationality, or the way that relational thinking emerges, actually has in some ways its hotbed in places like the Caribbean, but also, as I'm arguing in my work, in certain places of the Indian Ocean where the plantation complex travels. The plantation complex produces a certain kind of relational imaginary. And in some ways, our work as historians, I feel, an important work as historians, is to both retrieve that imaginary, but also to use it as a kind of analytic to understand history in a new way. Okay, so now let me walk through some slides, and then I'll conclude. Just this gives you a overview of some of the findings in this emerging book project. Definitions, processes, and arguments. So part of my interest is to think about how the plantation complex emerges. It begins in the 1400s, really, and it has its apex in the 20th century. It has its afterlife today, especially in the mechanized farming that our food systems are dependent upon. And it is characterized, I would say, by 3 things. One is by primitive accumulation. These are some technical terms, and I won't go into great detail now, but if you want to ask me, you can afterwards. More importantly, primitive accumulation, which is conquest and the robbing of lands and the robbing of people from their cultural ways. The force economy, that's more of a novel concept, I think. I'm defining here as the perpetuation of primitive accumulation under modern capitalism as a way of commanding labor, not through the wage, but through the use of the whip. So what I'm arguing is that what makes the plantation complex unique is that it is a site in which the force economy is being articulated and innovated. The whip as a technique of capitalism is being innovated. And what makes the plantation, of course, mining plays this role as well, but what makes the plantation economy unique is it is the mixing together of a force economy with agriculture and the varieties, the various forms of life that are being brought together under forcibly and reconstructed and reconstituted through this process. Okay, so let me move on. Caribbeanity, I'd like to define as a particular kind of force economy that grew out of this cultivation of cash crops, by which I mean sugar, cocoa, tobacco, cotton, later on tea, rubber, coconut, a variety of other primary resources, quote-unquote primary resources, but also the creolization, the chaos, the juxtapositions, the submarine intimacies, the relations and the forms of resistance and survival that emerge as part of this process. All of that I want to describe as Caribbeanity. Furthermore, I'd like to argue that we can see over the course of modern history the expansion of Caribbeanity. So for me this is important because while we may often think that the Caribbean, or let's say the Atlantic, the Great Divide between the two imperial oceans, the transatlantic and the Indian Ocean, the twain shall never meet. Thankfully they're meeting in the scholarship that we see emerging in our times. But one way in which these two imperial oceans meet is not just through the travel of goods and peoples and institutions, but it's also through the expansion of certain kinds of abstract entities. And the plantation is one of those abstract entities. The Caribbean, in some ways, is uprooted from the Caribbean itself and moves like a metastasis. That's kind of the metaphor I'm thinking of these days. Moves like a metastasis to other parts of the world and embeds itself. And there is a history to that, and here would be a kind of potted periodization. We move from the 1600s, in which there was sugar mercantilism, to the 1700s, in which there is the rise of the two jewels, or what they were called the pearls, in the necklace as opposed to the jewels in the crown. And those two pearls of the British and French necklaces, imperial necklaces, were of course Saint-Domingue at the time and Jamaica. So that was the height of the plantation complex in the Caribbean. To the turn of the 19th century, which is the rise of the first global expansion of Caribbeanity, takes place right at the time that Rose is writing. And her consciousness, her mind, is in fact refracting something that's taking place on a global scale, in which the Caribbean has begun to move across the seas. And this expands from the 1840s to the 1870s, in which we might call these the bonanza years of plantation expansion, in which we have the plantation economies of Sri Lanka, of today's Sri Lanka, of Malaya, of Assam, of Fiji, of the South Pacific, that is emerging. And there are direct links between what has happened in the Caribbean, the demise of those plantation gardens, and the reemergence that we see in other lobes of global empire. And then finally, we have a period of multinationalization, which I'm also thinking about as third worldification. There's a process in which multinational firms are beginning to construct that concept that has become normalized to us as the third world. Okay, so finally, so there are laborers, yes, that are circulating from east to west, but there's capital, crops, techniques, and institutions that are flowing from west to east, and that's the story of the expansion of Caribbeanity. Let me leave you with some images of the expansion of the Caribbean, of Caribbeanity, of the plantation complex, moving from the rimland of the Caribbean to working through that same periodization. By the turn of the 19th century, here we have, between the tropics of Capricorn and Cancer, the expansion of plantations. The same capitalists are involved. That's, for me, really interesting. And we can trace how the capital is flowing, how that slave compensation money is flowing, and a summary of the argument. So I'll stop there, and we can... But... It's exciting to have a community in which I feel like the questions fit as opposed to not really fitting. So thank you.